So, yeah, our final presentation this session is Force Majeure Car Dependency and Force Car Ownership in Canada by Stella Connaughton from Cornell University. Stella, whenever you're ready.
Great. Let me present. Hi, everyone. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. Great. So I'll get started. So, hi, everyone. My name is Stella. I actually just graduated from my master's degree in Cornell last week. And the paper that I'll be presenting and talking a little about today is Force Majeure, Forced Car Ownership and Auto Dependence in Canada. And this is a paper that I'm currently actually in the process of wrapping up with Majeure, who just presented, Matt Palm at UNC, as well as Nick Klein at Cornell University. So with that, I first wanted to give a little bit of context. Obviously, the session focuses a lot on transportation disadvantage. And as a result, most North American transportation scholarship has centered on really the lack of automobile access. And we talk about how vehicle deficient households have trouble getting around. And the outcomes of this have been widely studied. Lacking a car often significantly limits job opportunities and really depresses income, social inclusion, and things like that as well. And we also find that car dependence really harms households who can't really fully participate in it in a lot of these different dimensions, as have been really demonstrated in previous literature. And really, this focus on vehicle deficiency makes a lot of sense because carless households in an auto-oriented landscape, such as North America, face really real measurable disadvantages in reaching jobs, services, and opportunities. But today we're going to be really talking about transportation hardships among car-owning households. And this is really motivated by the fact that research on transportation hardships among specifically car-owning households is comparatively limited in North America, is mostly focused on automobile debt. And I think as a lot of us know already, owning a car definitely not the same as being able to afford one and be comfortable in owning a car. In Canada in 2022, before even all these recent gas prices, we find that 69% of Canadians say they might not be able to afford gasoline, and 75% of Canadian drivers in 2022 reported taking fewer trips to save on fuel. And we see that the income geography of Canada really compounds this problem as lower income households who historically have been able to live in transit-rich urban cores, but as they've been increasingly displaced among in the late 20th and 21st century to more car-dependent suburbs, this is where they're kind of put in situations where car ownership becomes really mandatory and required for a lot of people. And due to the fact that owning a car, maintaining one, repairing one, and all of that is really expensive, that means that a lot of low-income households we see are in this kind of cycle where they have to have a car in order to get to work and make money, but owning this car in and of itself is a huge financial burden to them. And that goes into this idea in transportation planning literature called forced car ownership, which really describes this cycle quite well. And they say due to lack of transportation alternatives, they have to spend more than they can afford on automobiles. And this hasn't been studied much in North America. It has mostly been studied in the UK, Germany, Australia, most recently China. And it's, as Markuson calls, a fuzzy concept. It can mean a lot of different things. I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience, when we hear forced car ownership, we think, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be forced to own a car? And some of the original definitions of forced car ownership really originally kind of went to the idea that you own a car because you lack alternatives. You just live in a place where the only place you can get around is with a car, mostly looking at rural areas. More recently, literature in Australia has tried to operationalize forced car ownership into a specific criteria. So, looking at high car ownership on low incomes, where they specify it's when you earn less than $500 Canadian. Australian dollars a week and own two plus cars. And then a lot of studies in Europe mostly focus on people who in addition to owning a car, also suffer from material deprivation and social exclusion, and saying that if you're facing these issues and you own a car, you're in this forced car ownership situation. And forced car ownership, especially in the North American and Canadian context, really matters because most American households do own cars. And focusing only on the car list really means that we might be undercounting mobility-related hardship and misdirecting interventions away from strained car owners who need them. While it's really important to focus on those who don't have cars and interventions to help them, it's also important to support low-income families who do have cars. And it really creates this tension in transportation planning where we really want to move people and make driving harder for people. But at the same time, we need to recognize that for many people in North America, owning a car and driving one every day is really the easiest way to get a job and make stable income. So with that, we really wanted to use the Mobilizing Justice survey to really study this idea of forced car ownership. And we had a few questions, right? The first one is, to what extent do Canadian households experience FCO? This has never been studied before. And since it's never been studied before, we were also really interested in looking at how we can reframe FCO for a Canadian context. And because the survey literally asks people, do you feel forced to own a car? We were interested in understanding, are single item survey questions effective to actually look at FCO? So with that, we'll go into some of the survey questions that we studied. So these were continuous variables, a self-assessment from 0 to 100. And the main question that we were really studying, and this is what was asked to participants in the survey, was, to what extent do you agree? I feel forced to own a car to access my daily activities. But given the fact and those other definitions of FCO that we provided, we didn't want to just look at how people responded to that and call it a day. We wanted to really study those other questions as well and really try to get a really nuanced understanding of who's experiencing FCO and what those profiles really look like. So other questions that we also felt were really relevant to the literature of forced car ownership in Canada was, if the mode of transport I use often most was suddenly not available, would I still be able to reach my daily activities? I have access to fewer or more transport options than I would like. I make fewer or more trips than I would like. I spend less and more on transportation than I can afford. And also the questions of whether or not they think driving in their neighborhood is affordable. And also whether they think driving in your neighborhood is enjoyable. Some of the controversy around the forced car ownership literature is the idea that low-income people can definitely want to have a car and like having a car and like driving, even if it does eat up a lot of their expenses. So something really exciting about this survey is the fact we can literally see how people say if they literally like driving or not. And that can give us a really nuanced understanding of, do people feel compelled to, or do they just like having a car? Oh, and then also if they felt like their overall transport options are worse or better than others. So also getting that relative perception as well. Yeah. So we thought that it would be a pretty straightforward paper. We started this in last fall, and we thought it would be pretty straightforward, and we would just do some correlations and then run a regression. And we thought that there would be a lot of really straightforward correlations between perceived forced car ownership and other relevant variables, such as the ones I just mentioned, as well as income. And we thought that forced car ownership would be strongest felt among low-income populations in rural areas where they don't have access to public transit. And the survey would actually allow us to understand which demographics are most likely to feel forced to own a car. So what did we find? We did not find that. We found that most people felt that they felt forced to own a car. And that makes sense, right? Because people who are answering this question in a survey aren't referring to the academic definitions. They're thinking, what does it mean to feel forced to own a car, right? If you live in an auto-dependent area, like most people in Canada do, you're going to be like, yes, I need a car to get around. So this chart kind of just shows that like the mode of people put 100% on that, and there was definitely more people who put above 50% in forced car ownership than below 50%. And we also did some correlations, which we thought were going to be super strong, super straightforward between the relationship between forced car ownership, which is on the y-axis, and these attitudinal factors. And in fact, the strongest correlation we were able to find was forced car ownership and the ability to make trips without most used mode. And actually, that correlation isn't even the most strong. It was just a zero point 0.3 coefficient. So this data was really messy. And we even see with things that we also thought was going to be really straightforward, such as driving in one's neighborhood is affordable and feeling forced to own a car. We saw that there was only a coefficient of 0.1, meaning that this forced car, a lot of people feel forced to own a car, and they have very different ideas of whether or not it's affordable or not, which really kind of creates a tension between the current literature that's around forced car ownership with this emphasis on low-income households. We also found that this question, the survey also asked whether or not people felt forced to use active transportation or they feel forced to use public transportation in addition. And we compared to the LICO threshold, so those who are like above and below the poverty thresholds. And we find that while more people below the poverty threshold do feel forced to own a car compared to feeling forced to use active transportation and public transportation, we actually find that the people who are most likely to feel forced to own a car are those who are above the LICO by 200% or above, or in between 100 and 200%. And then we also see that a lot of low-income people relatively feel forced to actually use active transportation or use public transportation. So we're actually seeing this trend that pretty significant amount of low income people don't feel forced to own a car, and a significant amount of higher income people also feel forced to own a car. So it wasn't really cut and dry. We also find when we looked at a spatial arrangement of those who feel forced to own a car, this is Toronto, for example, that the data was kind of fuzzy. We can kind of see some clusters in the middle that people who are least likely to feel forced to own a car are kind of clustering in downtown Toronto, but we kind of see this hodgepodge of different numbers and things like that. We didn't see really straightforward clusters. So we were really interested in because of the fact that there was this wide variety of incomes, geography, and lifestyles of those who feel forced to own a car, we were interested in understanding those profiles. And we did a latent profile analysis, which is a clustering technique that is often used to really separate I guess like separate people into observed subgroups, which we call profiles or latent classes, and each profile has a characteristic pattern across indicators, and the model's job is to really recover those like different observed groups within and estimate for each individual the probability that they belong in each profile. So we took a bunch of indicators, which I'll show in the next slide, and we used all of those to kind of construct different profiles of those who feel forced to own a car. And using just like understanding, like using like model fit and things like that, we found that there were four groups. And we were really interested in seeing in these profiles with that traditional profile of FCO, which is like low income, church suppression, social exclusion, is that going to show up? So this is the conceptual model that we did. So the indicators to your left are the things that we actually put into the model. So we fed the model everyone whose most frequent mode is driving a car and also how they answered on all these different questions. And using that, we generated four latent profiles. And then on the right are the covariates. So these weren't actually used in the model to construct the classes, but we were interested in seeing how these classes, how the differences between gender, ethnicity, age, and sexual orientation can vary within the classes, and whether or not some covariates are more likely to appear in certain classes than others. So we can now jump into the results. So our final sample, after filtering out one responded to who actually answered every question, and two who responded to whose most frequent mode was driving. And using all those indicators that I showed below, we were able to construct four classes. So our first class is one that we call multimodal drivers, which were 21% of our class analysis. And they reported a very low reported FCO. The mean was about 21. It was out of 100. And they reported having alternatives to driving. They were really satisfied with transport options, their trips taken, costs, and they also really enjoy driving. So this is a group that likes driving and doesn't feel forced to own a car, even though it's their most frequent mode. And most importantly, even if they don't have their car, they have other options for getting around. Our second class was what we call content drivers, and they were our biggest group. They were 47% of those who we conducted the class analysis on. And they had a very high self-reported FCO score, among the highest. And they had less alternatives to driving, but they were satisfied with their transport options, trips taken, costs, and enjoy driving. And this is a really important group to hone in on because this is groups who report really high FCO, but are okay with that, and they like driving and they don't find it expensive. So this is where we're kind of seeing that a lot of people who indicate they're feeling forced to own a car pretty much are fine with that. Now we kind of get into the not so happy groups, right? So our third class, which was 27% of our sample, are what we call discontent drivers, who have a high self-reported FCO, no alternatives to driving, they're unsatisfied with their transport options, and they dislike driving. And actually, they take more trips than they would like to by driving. So this is a group that has a higher income compared to the traditional FCO group, but still feel forced to own a car, don't have those options, but they're not having to make those trade-offs. And then finally, we see actually our traditional FCO group do pop up, and that's the cost constrained, which is only 5% of our sample. And they have a high FCO, no alternatives to driving, They're low income. They indicate they have to suppress trips and they don't take as many as they would like, and they're unsatisfied with their transport options. They think they pay too much for driving and they own fewer cars than they would like. So when we look into the literature, when we look at traditional definitions, this is the group that really pops up. And I'll kind of rush through this for the sake of time, but these were kind of our distributions. So how people felt forced to own a car. We see the multimodal drivers don't feel forced to, the other ones do. We see that the cost-constrained group, by and large, are the ones who feel like they're least able to reach activities without their main mode. They're also by far the lowest income one. However, it's important to flag that all groups had pretty widespread ranges in income. No group is predominantly lower income or higher income. And kind of going into our covariate analysis, which I'll just kind of quickly summarize in the interest of time, we see that, and these are kind of just like the disparities between the different classes for these different things. So we see that cost-constrained groups drive less, while the multimodal and the discontent drivers drive the most. We see that cost-constrained drivers are less likely to have higher education. They are slightly less likely to be white and more likely to be non-white, but there wasn't huge differences across the sample.
Sorry,
We find out,
Stella, before you
oh,
proceed, can you just explain, like, if can you just go back one slide and just kind of explain what the chart means? Like, what's on the different axes here and how do we interpret these charts?
yeah, of course. So this is a covariate distribution. So these are after we separated all the people into the different classes. We broke down each class by all these different factors, and these are within class distributions. So this is one's pretty easy. For Canadian citizen, right, we see that for most classes, for multimodal content drivers and discontent drivers, it's about 95% of the class are Canadian citizens. While for cost-constrained drivers, it's a little bit lower, around 90%, so about a 5% difference. So the wider kind of the range between them, that's the bigger the disparity in how different each class is sociodemographically. So we see that also if you want to do like another example with like driving frequency. Cost-constrained drivers are the least likely to report daily. Only about a little more than 50% say that they drive daily, while discontent drivers, 75, almost 75% of them say that they drive daily. So that's just like, if that makes sense. So then we also see that women are the most likely to indicate that they're discontent drivers. They're the highest share of that. And then when we look in age ranges, we also see that not huge differences between whether or not there's children or not. Discontent drivers are more likely to have kids, and they're also, but less likely to have someone who's elderly within their household. But multimodal drivers are more likely to say they have someone older in their household as well. And we also see among mental health condition, among those who say that they experience mental health issues often or always, we see that the discontent drivers and the cost constrained are almost about 25%, while the content and the multimodal drivers are only a little bit about like 5% or so. So we do see a big disparity between that group as well. And then one of the ones we also see a big disparity between as well is that cost-constrained drivers, although the proportions are still pretty small, are more likely to report being rural, which makes sense and aligns with the literature on that. And we also see in terms of sexual orientation, LGBTQ people are also more likely to feel cost-constrained or discontent compared to content or multimodal. And then, of course, transit available, it makes sense. It also makes sense. We find that cost-constrained drivers are much less likelier to have transit available in their neighborhood compared to those who are multimodal, which makes sense because those are people who say they don't have alternatives versus people who do say that they have alternatives. And then quickly for some geographical analysis, we also calculated density gradients from the distance from kind of the CBDs of some major Canadian cities. We actually don't find a huge difference in this, and this is a big trend that we've been finding just throughout. There hasn't been too much geographic variation for any of our classes. So we see right here, this is kind of showing the prevalence of each class by distance to downtown Toronto. So a function of this is also density. So about 25 miles, there's just more people probably living around there. And this is among people whose most frequent mode is driving. So people who live right near Toronto, their most frequent mode is probably not driving, which is why we see pretty low in numbers among all classes. but we don't see not many like disparities between them. Same with distance from downtown Montreal. We do see that multimodal drivers are among the highest, which makes sense, and then that goes down as they get further from downtown. And then Vancouver is the one we see actually the most disparities. We do see that the cost constrained, it has that more kind of like radial from the center that as you get further from Vancouver downtown, the cost constraint do rise up. So we do kind of see that more like expected pattern that there's more cost constrained people the further away from downtown Vancouver you are. And then with that, I just want to end it with a few takeaways. And we noticed that lots of people really feel forced to own a car, and this spans across incomes, geographies, and household structures. And asking directly if one feels forced to own a car might not give the most useful data overall, which is why we tried to construct these profiles based on all these different indicators, because of the fact that so many people in Canada feel forced to own a car. And understanding FCO perceptions in tandem with other indicators give us a wide array of responses. And I think a really important takeaway and something that's surprising is that not everyone who feels forced to own a car are necessarily unhappy with it, but a lot are. And even if they aren't socially excluded or indicate having suppressed trips because of it, they're still indicating unsatisfaction with the built environment, unsatisfaction with car dependence as well, in addition to groups who are also seeing that trip suppression and things like that as well. And I leave all with a question of whether or not we should be reconsidering what forced car ownership is and even the semantics of that word, especially in a North American context where basically everyone is forced to own a car. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella, for your presentation. I can see there's a comment in the chat box about the location of employment as a factor in forced car ownership and driving distance. Any other questions? Okay, just a quick question from me. Did you see any spatial clustering of different classes in your model?
Yeah, so we did try one of when I was mentioning earlier where we didn't find as much geographic disparities as we imagined. We did do some global Moran and Lisa, and we found that for the local indicators of clustering, basically it was non-significant across like all of Canada for like 95% of the clusters. So we didn't really find that many significant hotspots. And then for any like global brand we wrote, either like across Canada nationwide or even within the city, it was all pretty like zero point 0.1, things like that at most. So it was surprising to us. And I think it's also because we're not looking at everybody in these cities, right? A lot of people who maybe would be multimodal car owner, like probably also don't have a car and things like that. And we're only focusing on those and even people like have a car but maybe don't drive it as much since our sample only looked at those whose most frequent mode was driving.
Thank you.
Stella, I'm not sure if you see the comment in the chat about like distances traveled and distance to work, and wondering if you looked at those variables in the model or in the survey.
We did not actually. And I think that would be really interesting to look at as well. So I'll make a note of that. But yeah, I appreciate that because that's an important thing. So yeah,
Superb. Thank you so much.
thank you.